Welcome, everybody, to Radicalized Truth Survives, episode 155. Today, High Fidelity and I are bringing back Dr. Michael MacKay. He is a geopolitical analyst with a lot of experience working in Ukraine. He's not only going to talk to us about Russia's ongoing war with the West, but he's going to talk to us about what we can do about it. Have a listen. Dr. Michael MacKay, thank you as always for taking the time to be with us. It means so much to us. You are one of our OGs, and I really need this interview today. I'll tell you part of the reason why. Let's just start with what I need to kind of purge my system of. I do not follow Alexander Dugin on Twitter. I do not follow Kirill Dmitriev on Twitter. I do not follow the propagandist Solofiev on Twitter. I don't follow these people, but they are populating my For You feed all the time. And it's gotten to the point where I looked back and I realized it has been 3 years since I interviewed you for Byline Times in our first Unmusked piece. You said Elon Musk was going to turn Twitter into VKontakte and that it was going to be a Russian information warfare outlet under the guise of a social media platform. And 3 years later, the transition has been complete. And I want to start there because on Monday, I had a terrible case of the psychological battery blues simply because I could not get rid of these people in my feed as I was looking for good information from people like you and my allies in this fight. And why do you think my feed is populated with Russian propagandists, not even the US kind, the actual from Russia kind?
Yeah, and sometimes it's not even passed through the filter of the fake American patriot that we're used to seeing. Sometimes it's so urgent, it's direct, um, and we can see that. Um, well, why it's gotten worse is the weapons at Elon Musk's disposal have gotten worse. If we were looking at 3 years ago, what he was able to do was take the existing algorithm and game it for fascism. For example, bringing back the hate propaganda accounts as so bringing them back and even giving them uh, some kind of validation as removing the state media label. Of course, destroying the whole meaning behind a blue tick. For example, I have one, but that's only because I have a lot of followers. you know, but otherwise, your suspicion is somebody's paid for it, so they can do that. And then there's the For You, which is easy to tweak with the algorithm. But what's gotten worse over the last 3 years is artificial intelligence and Grok and making that seamless. So that now what appears as news has in fact been filtered through a manipulated machine learning algorithm. So that's, Russia is the number one poisoner of large language models. So that, you can say, oh, it's an aggregation of all the information that's on the internet, but it's quantity over quality, of course, without any discipline from facts or truth or evidence or reality. And so if the preponderance of the internet says um, um, Russia is liberating Donbass because Ukraine bombed Donbass for 8 years. It's literally that language every single time. Now, it's completely false, and no evidence is ever presented, but it's put out there. And as I think I've said more than once, and I believe I'm quoting Gary Kasparov here, in Elon Musk's Twitter X, a lie is another point of view to the truth. And it's actually given more weight because of the way that these large language models and current generative artificial intelligence works.
It's incredible to me because I used to have to get my Russian propaganda from Julia Davis's feed. She does Russian Media Watch, and so I would kind of hear what they were saying, but now it's right there. And again, I don't follow them. Some of the accounts I have blocked, and they are still populating my feed. So this cannot be random. It has to be to try to push that agenda. And it's all the decadent West. It's all the shite that we're used to hearing. But seeing it, I felt so kind of bludgeoned by the language, the depravity of the language, particularly directed at Ukrainians. It felt violating. And so my what I did the next day is I was actually searching on Twitter. It's still very useful for many things. And I was actually searching for a list of Russian broken treaties, broken promises, broken, convention agreements, etc. And I found myself, I hit a very rich vein of accounts from Romania and the Czech Republic and Lithuania and just like the Baltics in general. And I found so many rich accounts that had such great, incisive, biting insight and commentary that was completely, backed by truth and a way to sort of push out the narrative of the Russians. And I found it very cleansing in a way. It was very interesting. It was like I got this heavy dose, kind of mainlining truth. And again, on Twitter, you can expect a degree of the people to be actors acting one way or the other. But it felt really, really good. I just kind of bathed myself in truth and people who understand what the Russian psychological operators are up to, and that was a good day for me. You're still there. Our viewers know that you've been doing this work for more than a decade, informing people on what's happening in Ukraine and this war. And I guess we may as well just get right to it. How do you think these show trials are going? Talk to us about the quote unquote peace plan.
If I can, I just want to add to what you were saying about your discoveries on Twitter X. Um, and it's what has evolved into my own survival strategy. So it's really not for everybody. Um, because, in early days, I engaged with the trolls. I didn't know any better. I thought that this was about debate. So first of all, I don't look at for you ever. It's only following. And you might notice people that go to my feed, I do not have a large follower list. And it's biased towards Ukrainians um, and other longstanding accounts that I have. I never use Grok, and I treat that as a red flag when others do. It's confirmation bias is what people are doing, the trolls and the bots. And the other thing I do is I'm I'm not active, but I'm a reader of Telegram because, yes, it is run by a Russian oligarch. Yes, it is used by the Russians for information warfare, in fact, for military and communications. But there's Ukrainians there too. And it's this unfiltered, in Ukrainian language, um, uh, feed. And so by reading what's there, I don't take it on faith, but I pick up on things, the sensibility. So for example, some of the, you know, kind of dark humor of the Ukrainians comes through and their terminology for things. And then I look in other places. So now I'll look in X and other places for what they're talking about there. So it's raw, it's unfiltered, um, it's unreliable, but it is the genesis of some of my ideas.
I am literally craving the words you're about to say to help purge my, brain of the false reporting that we've all been seeing about the quote unquote peace plan?
My first reaction is I can't believe how people have no memory whatsoever. It doesn't even go back a week. So, for example, if you were to go back to 2017 and read my feed, you would read my comments about a fake peace plan generated by the Russians and filtered through Trump. At that time, I called it the Surrender Crimea Plan because at that time, Crimea was occupied and there was a partial occupation of Luhansk and Donetsk regions. Um, and it was being shopped to Trump through uh, this Russian trader who was an MP at the time, um, and through various people who were active around the Trump circle, like Stephen Miller and people like that. Oh, Michael Flynn as well. Um, so they were the go-betweens for what I called a surrender Crimea plan. And and then Trump was presenting it as a peace plan because he didn't know anything. Um, and but you could see it was written in the Kremlin. So, but of course, 2017, that's ancient history. But the Russians have been doing the same thing all along. So there have never been negotiations where people consider the other point of view and so on. It's never, ever happened with the Russians. So anytime we see these things, first of all, if there's a meeting, the agenda has already been set by the Russians. So we know that anything approaching a real peace plan, there would never be a meeting in the first place. So it is all a show. It is political theater. Um, this latest plan is created in by the Kremlin, and it was never meant to bring about a ceasefire or peace or negotiations or anything other than to draw out the Russian operatives in the Trump administration and elsewhere. I mean, look at how it came out. It hit instantly. Trump and Witkoff were on side. Within hours, Orban in Hungary and Fico in Slovakia were trumpeting this thing as the path to peace and so on. And then the press started to tweak in on it, and the language had already been set by the Russians. So there was no way to look at this. So when the Ukrainians chimed in and said, well, this is the maximal demands of Russia. This is what they demanded in 2015, soon after the invasion. Nothing has changed whatsoever. In fact, they're demanding impossible things like surrendering territory that Ukraine controls completely. Um, and then you look at all the things that are missing from it. That's another thing to know that it's not a genuine plan. Nothing about refugees and internally displaced persons. Nothing about kidnapped children. Nothing about reparations. Who's going to pay for the restoration of Ukraine? So nothing. Oh, and of course, no security guarantees whatsoever to Ukraine. Um, so the idea that any country fighting for its survival would consider such a thing is absurd. And so we see, realize, yes, it is absurd. And the Russians didn't intend that to be the effect. It was an active measure. And what has been the effect? Delay. Delay in sanctions by Trump, who, the threat of serious sanctions, stopping congressional action on sanctions, stopping the European Union from uh, deploying frozen Russian assets towards Ukraine. Uh, just a day or so ago, Italy saying, oh, we won't participate in the buying US weapons program because it would derail the peace process. So it delayed even that way to get American weapons to Ukrainian defenders. So it succeeded brilliantly. And of course, we see that it completely succeeded with the news media, who have been completely uncritical and failed the public trust yet again.
Wow. I have a follow-up question, but Hi-Fi, you jump in.
So, when we talk about the media, it appears to be compromised, corrupted, or incompetent. Uh, it doesn't matter which because the outcome is the same. We are misled. When we talk about social media being corrupted and in this case blatantly malevolent, feeding us, racist tropes and pro-Russian messaging. Um, this is information warfare. This is cognitive warfare. This is war against the minds of people. Today, we had a British MP state that Russia carried out an act of war with the Novichok poisoning. When do you think that Europe and Canada and other still free democratic societies will recognize that Russia is at war with the world?
I've always wondered that, and you made a good point about Novichok. At the time, I was saying, oh, well, this is an act of war. I mean, and I use the term, oh, this is a chemical warfare attack against British citizens, because let's not forget that the targets were in fact British citizens. Um, um, but we can go back even earlier than that to the Alexander Litvinenko. So that goes even before the invasion of Ukraine. I mean, that was a chemical warfare attack on British soil against a British citizen, because Litvinenko was a British citizen. Um, so these were acts of war, but somehow it doesn't. There's so many excuses not to confront reality. Oh, we haven't declared war, so we can't be at war. Oh, we haven't declared that Russia's a terrorist state, so these can't be terrorist acts. So go back to the comfortable. Oh, some people carried out a criminal act, which is true, but it's like the most minor aspect of it. So people have always found comfort. Now, your question was, when will Canada, other European countries, um, other than Ukraine, realize that Russia is at war with them? I don't know. Some countries have elected leaders who are are actually leading and pointing these things out. Donald Tusk in Poland, for example, although then they went and elected a president, largely ceremonial, who was the opposite. Um, you know, coming up with all these anti-Ukrainian statements. Um, Finland, Prime Minister Stubb, sorry, President Stubb, he's very good. Uh, and Kaja Kallas, the EU Vice President and Head of Foreign Policy, she's very good. Um, and they're trying to lead. But I see they're trying to lead kind of in the way that FDR was trying to lead Americans before 1941. And, you know, in the face of the isolation movement and so on. So there's still this, we don't want to start a war reaction. And the leaders have to say, well, wait a minute. What we want to do is defend ourselves when we are at war. And it's very difficult to get the public behind that. Um, Eastern Europe society is there. And the point is to bring Western Europe, oh, and Northern Europe, I should say as well. They're very in tune as well. But Western Europe and Southern Europe are very much out of it. And as long as we have things like the unanimity rules in NATO and the EU, it's going to be a problem. But all we can do is point out the ways in which Russia is at war, to talk about the
Yeah.
Novichok poisoning as an act of war, to talk about this fake peace plan as an act of war. We can call it an active measure, we can call it hybrid warfare, but it is war. And it reveals who's on what side in the war. Um, I think it's encouraging that more Americans who aren't necessarily aware of all the details of it are tweaking onto the fact something's wrong with this Witkoff guy.
Yeah.
Um, you know, um, is he really for me? And people saying, I don't see that, which is good.
Right.
If people can get that, starts with a feeling, um,
Yeah.
and we can hammer home facts that things like the symbolism of Trump clapping when Putin came onto the tarmac in Anchorage. Um, that image resonates with people. Seeing Witkoff beaming with happiness at meeting Putin the other day, and then and his hand to his heart, and then we see him a couple days before that in Miami pulling his chair back from the table, and I wrote that he looked like death warmed over
Yeah.
because he would he would rather be shot than be in that room at that point because he was exposed.
Yeah.
So what can we do? We have to expose these people and we have to expose what they do, um, and put it in the language that people understand. One of my more popular tweets in the last few weeks was I said, I don't want war. Nobody wants war. But the question is, what do we do when Russia's at war with us?
That's right.
Um,
That's exactly the question to pose. I've been doing a series with a Ukrainian historian, and it is so profoundly important in the work that I do, um and just the fact that nothing starts when you think it starts. Like when you talk about Trump Russia, it doesn't start in 2016. You go back to 2014, you go back to the 1980s when she was giving us a lecture on the Stalin's man-made famine. You don't start in 32. You go back to, a decade before. You go back to the early 20s, you go back to the 1880s. And what I'm seeing now is what Jim Stewartson, our other podcast partner, calls, I'm seeing people be truth curious. And we have to be there for them. Even if we've been doing this work for a decade and we understand the ins and outs, we have to be there to, in simple language, help guide them, even if they are just sort of starting to figure out that something is wrong. And one of the things the historian Tatiana said is, we're already at war. Whether we like it or not, whether we understand cognitive warfare or not, we are already at war. Of course, Russia's always at war, but we too are at war. Unfortunately, we haven't had leadership responding in any way that can bring people together the way we've done in past wars. And I do appreciate what Macron has been saying lately. He's definitely been getting up there, being aware of the battlefield and the psychological battlefield on the internet. And it's interesting because the way I'm seeing Russia target the EU and Macron and the women leaders in the European Union is very much what I saw a decade ago with the way they attacked Hillary Clinton. The same types of narratives. They are putting a lot of money into trying to do everything to discredit the EU and France's leader, and it's quite interesting when you actually see all these patterns. But one thing that I always like to do here on this show and why we bring you on is because it's important to get a reality check. And one of the things we know is Russia's broke. They can't pay their soldiers. They've got regions that are running deficits. The last 9 months, many regions in Russia have been running deficits. And so I see so much of the smoke and mirrors as being completely upside down and inverted. And I would love for you to talk a little bit of that about that. Give us some reality on what is really happening in Russia and why they can't afford to end the war. They can't afford peace. They certainly can't afford, any of it. They can't afford to stop it.
yes, Russia is broke and they cannot afford to maintain warfare at this constant level. But they're caught in a trap. You see, Russia is undertaking offensive operations in every area of the battlefront, yet military sense, economic sense, strategic sense says they can't do it. But that doesn't stop them. See, Putin's trapped in a bubble of his own lies. You see, his commanders tell him about great victories, and so he's hinging everything on that, and yet it's not true. Um, I posted a map a couple weeks ago to point out my report about artillery shelling and rocket attacks in 2015 around the city of Horlivka, which at that time was Russian occupied, and a town nearby called Toretsk. And then I posted a map from today, and the Russians are a little bit west of Toretsk now, about 40 kilometers away. In a war where the full scale aspect of it from 2022, let alone from 2014 when the invasion started, is just about to go over the time frame of the Soviet Union's war against Nazi Germany. So a period which saw great defeats in Ukraine and Belarus and all the way to the gates of Moscow and to Stalingrad, and then reversals, and of course, ultimately the siege of Berlin, all in the same time frame. In the same time frame, Russia has gone about 40 kilometers west and lost approximately 1.2 million men in doing it. That's another part of being broke. They can't afford to pay these men to die for Russia. So what they do is they lie. They promise them contracts. And then when they are killed, they list them as missing so that they don't have to pay their families. Or they simply just don't pay them, and you're at the front. What are you going to do? And of course, they've got the Kadyrovites to force them into battle as well. So, but by the time they get there, they realize, oh, it is a death sentence. They've already emptied the prisons. And so that's not going to happen. Stealth mobilization doesn't work. Ukraine has degraded Russia's ability to finance the war with its strikes on oil terminals, oil pipelines, and so on. So year over year, Russia's revenue from the entire energy sector is down 34%. So every Russian railways is bankrupt. And of course, you have to have railways to fight modern mechanized warfare. I posted a video not long ago to show what the nature of the war is now. The Russians are not able to carry out modern, armored, combined arms warfare in any way. They're carrying out warfare that's not much different than would have happened 2,000 years ago in that part of the world. Men marching on foot. Now, they don't have horses now, but they've got motorcycles and these, I call them Chinese golf carts. They're basically kind of dune buggies without any armor or protection and so on, but very few of those. So they're basically walking across a kill zone that's about 20 kilometers wide to try to achieve a position, raise a flag so the video can be taken, and then it doesn't matter if they live or die because the propaganda effect was there, and usually they do die.
Oh, hi-fi.
One thing I don't understand about the supposed peace talks between the United States and Russia, we have Witkoff, who is nominally, an appointee, political appointee, but then we have Jared Kushner. Kushner is not appointed to any position. Kushner gets millions from Russia and their allies like Saudi Arabia, China. Why is Jared Kushner there?
Because it's almost like there's no need for artifice anymore. There's no pretense of diplomacy when he's there, because how could there be? So clearly Trump or the people around him want to show that it's not about diplomacy, it's not about Russia, it's not about Ukraine, it's about some deal. Um, and they're not ashamed to talk about it benefiting the the Trump family and the oligarchs around him. Uh, so there's actually a lack of artifice about the whole thing by having him there. So I think having him there is a signal that it is just it's a meeting between crime bosses is what it is, and they're not really going to go to any effort to pretend it's anything else.
I know that when we just keep asking you questions that we are going to get our answers. It's a meeting between crime bosses. I was just about to ask you, what should we be calling these peace talks, these peace plans, the 28, what should we as members of independent media that want to get the wording right, what should we call this?
Um, well, it doesn't flow off the tongue, but at one point I called it the Russian war wish list. Um,
That's not bad.
um,
I
eh,
like the meeting between crime bosses, actually. I
that's
think
actually
that's
good too. Um, but there's you're aware that I've been talking about Russian aggression in many different kinds of terms. Um, just to get people to think about what's really going on and not what they're hearing. For example, talking about the Putin Kremlin crime syndicate. And if we want to get into it, let's talk about how the with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the mafia merged with the former Communist Party, but then the Siloviki, the security men around the KGB, ultimately led by Putin, rose to the top of this crime family. So I call that the Putin Kremlin crime syndicate. And
brilliant.
we can get into the Siloviki and so on. I've also talked about the Moscow Empire because people don't want to talk about imperialism because, oh, that's in the past. And, oh, Africa went through decolonization, so that's the end of that. No, uh, Moscow imperialism has been with us for 400 years. And I've been talking about how, well, this is the unaddressed historical agenda. It should have been addressed at Versailles. It was not. It should have been addressed with the resolution of World War II. It was not. So the opportunity, and now we have another opportunity to say there's no business for a decrepit empire to still exist um, in the 21st century. And then we talk about colonialism, which is, and that makes sense of things like Russia's passportization, very ugly word, but where they force Russian passports on Ukrainian citizens.
Right.
Story today by Euromaidan Press, a teenager in occupied Luhansk, I believe, who was pregnant and was forced to take Russian citizenship or they wouldn't give her a C-section. And then they registered her baby as a Russian citizen. So the horror of that as part of genocide. So I talk about that in the context of colonialism. Then genocide, another thing we're not comfortable talking about, the kidnapping of children, what I just described, denying that Ukraine is a nation, that Ukrainian is a language, that being Ukraine, that Ukraine has a heritage or an identity is genocide. And people who say, oh, let's talk about other genocides and the number of people killed, say, no, you're missing the point. There have been history is filled with mass murders and crimes against humanity and so on. But there's something else about genocide that is about the eradication of a nation. It's about a collective and an identity. And so we should be talking about genocide. And so this is the language: crime syndicate, imperialism, colonialism, genocide, that helps us make sense of why Russia is at war and why the only way the war could end in a way that will lead to peace is to defeat Russia, for
Absolutely.
Ukraine to be victorious,
Yeah.
ultimately for the Moscow Empire to be broken up, as all empires must fall in an age of self-determination of peoples, which we all believe in or should believe in. So to go back to our earlier statement, where are we in our thinking that that is the path to peace? My feed is still flooded with the "you're a warmonger," because I encourage a defense, a collective defense of West and the values that are, in fact, worthy that we have in our civilization, and defending it against an enemy that will not stop until it is stopped.
Wow.
Um,
Wow. I got to tell you, that is so powerful. All the interviews you do with us, I always learn these really profound lessons that actually really informs my work in the days and weeks and months and years to come. And this is one of those moments. I remember you were the first person who said, don't use Russian backed separatist. That's propaganda language. You were like, don't. And it really was like, we continually reuse and repurpose the propagandist language, and you just gave us an entire arsenal of words to use that can actually puncture through those really thin veils that they put up. So I'm very grateful. I can't wait to start deploying some of those words. And when you talk about eradicating identity, I just learned from the uh, lecture from the Ukrainian historian that I brought into my Substack, Tetiana Boryak, when she talked about the executed Renaissance. She said that she began with, this was about erasing identity in the executing of writers, artists, etc. But she talked about how not only would they kill the writer, they would remove the burial ground, they'd kill the family, they would do absolutely everything to purge any trace of somebody who was an independent thinker from the archives, because proper words and identity are very dangerous to these regimes. So it actually kind of, even though it's very sad to hear all this, it actually kind of made me realize just how very valuable this work is. Even though it always feels like a David and Goliath fight, I would still rather be on this side doing everything I can to inform people to the best of my ability. My last question for you, and I'm sure Hi-Fi has some other thoughts, um, is simply that you understand history, and you know these people, you know these Russians, you know them. You're the one who told me that they're not even that creative or clever. They're always using the same, means all the time. It's nothing that's unpredictable. From that perspective, what can you tell people who may just be catching on to the proximity of their own danger and their own country's danger?
um, yes, I was thinking about that, and the argument of that some people might make, oh, maybe it's not a genocide because the numbers of people killed is not as great in the past. And you said, but don't forget how inefficient the Russians are. Don't forget how corrupt they are. Um, uh, or that their military objectives not being met. Don't forget that officers will simply steal money meant for weapons and just, you know, build a dacha for themselves somewhere. Um, Now, this should be an asset for us to use the inefficiency and corruption of the enemy against them. But don't neglect the danger of this carelessness as well, because the Russians really don't care. Um, So they don't care if someone murders a Ukrainian refugee in Germany and then someone gets caught and then it's shown that they were paid off by the Russians and fled to Belarus or something. They just don't care. Um, because first of all, they'll then wait for the non-reaction And then this is confirmation, and they'll do it again in another way. So their war against us will be messy, it will be chaotic, it will be unpredictable, it will be rife with inefficiency and corruption, but they will never stop. And they will always expand this war, look at new ways to attack us until we unite and come to our senses and do common sense things like don't issue visas to Russians to travel freely in Europe and across every border. This is nuts. Don't do business with a Russian entity because it's not now on the sanctions list. Um, you know, we've got to have unity amongst countries and cohesion in our approach. They're fighting a total war for us. Now, the word total war has changed. We used to think of, oh, that means that, unrestricted warfare and air, they've got air forces and navies and armies and they're attacking us. Now it's more than that. It's information warfare, as you were pointing out. It's cyber warfare. It's so much more, but it is total war. It is active measures, it's assassinations, it's sabotage, um, it's all of these things. If we bring these ideas together, these these are not isolated events, but if we show that there's this pattern, um, and talk about them as acts of war, then we can start to think about, well, how do we first defend ourselves, and then how do we defeat the enemy?
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, High Fidelity.
When we talk about these things that are acts of war, I just want to make sure I'm not missing any here. So we have the intentional murder of citizens of a different country through poison. We have assassination attempts on the heads of industries. We have bombings and spying carried out by citizens hired on Telegram. We have false flag to Tushki type protests globally. We have, and to me, this seems to be the biggest one. We have Russia funneling money to the politicians of foreign countries. And I think, Fitzo, Vukic, Nathan Gill in the UK taking Russian bribes. We had Marine Le Pen getting hit. We obviously have business connections between Trump and Russia. Um, when will, how can we get people to understand that this is part of the larger war, that Russia has been at war with the West since the end of World War II, basically. Um, why why are so many people against seeing that, considering this continuous pattern of things that they are doing? To each and every country, we can point and say they did this, they did this, they did this. And yet
And
no country will cohesively talk to their allies and be like, excuse me, it seems as if we're under attack.
well, before Michael even answers that, there are so many things to add to that list. There are now the drones. They're what they do in the sea. They're what they do underwater, the cutting of the cables, and all the straw men that are used to funnel money into parties. There's backing third-party candidates. It's just, and again, Michael and I mapped it out in nearly 2 dozen countries, all of these techniques over and over and over again. So what you're describing is even magnified to an even greater degree. So and I'd love to hear Michael's response to it because it seems like madness.
Well, I'll add one more thing, and it might lead towards an answer here. And it's to your point about Russia supporting these political leaders and so on. But along with that, is the massive information warfare effort to make it seem as if there's this large base of support behind them. Um, the symbolism of this is when Trump announced his candidacy for president in, I guess, was it late 2015? We rode down the escalator. And of course, we now know that all those people behind him were paid actors. I think they were all paid $50 to show up and so on. So, and you amplify that on the internet, and you've got the MAGA movement. And then we've seen the effect of this amplification in so many ways to make it look as if there's this great dissension um, to break down political cohesiveness. I think one of the worst that we saw was during COVID and the anti-vaccine, anti-mask mandate stuff that was coming out. And it seemed like there was this mass movement, but it was artificial. There were more minor ones. The backlash against Black Lives Matter, the backlash against um, the the women's movement in reaction to
Yeah, the Women's March. They infiltrated the
Women's March.
Women's March. Yes, yes, 100%.
Um, yeah, sorry. What was it called? The Me Too movement? I'm trying to think of the kind of catchphrase.
Time's up
Yeah,
and me
Yes, me
too. Yeah.
too. Me
yeah,
too.
me too. So you look at um, you know, sensible, what I would call civil society initiatives. Me Too, Black Lives Matter, um, and then there's this massive backlash, but it's all online, and it's artificial. So this is also a huge part of Russian information warfare. Um, how do we insulate against that? Um, we look at countries that have been more successful in realizing what's going on. Ukraine, number one. But I would also point a country that's not now at war, Finland. They're also very good at this. They educate their young people about fake news and trolls and bots and so on. It's part of their education. Um, you know, we would call this just basic skepticism, which is part of becoming a mature citizen. But we have to take the technology into account now as well. And so this kind of basic literacy is a part of that. Um, but that's just one piece of a puzzle. Since the war against us is so massive, we need a mobilization. Um, that's equivalent to the mobilization that we did have in the Second World War. Um, and Canada and the United States are good examples in that war. Canada a little bit 2 years earlier, but the US eventually. Total mobilization meant devoting the industrial economy towards war production, um, uh, devoting national budgets towards the armed forces and this kind of thing. Now it's even more nuanced than that. But why do we not have cyber defense forces? Um, we're not defending ourselves, let alone striking back at the enemy. See, that's another where we could learn from Ukrainians. Not only are they defending themselves by banning, for example, VKontakte and moving to other platforms, but because they understand Russian so well, they're actually very good at counter operations to seed. So, for example, they know Russians are very prone to conspiracy theories. They expect that the government lies to them about everything all the time, and so they can plant. The Ukrainians can plant these wonderful
Wow.
operations, and you say, well, that's not true, and then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because of the way it spins out of control with the rumor mill amongst the Russians. So it's very, we can learn from them is what I can say.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I was just thinking about the historian telling me that the Soviet Union, even its name has always been a lie, she said. She was like, it was always the Russian state, but they called it the Soviet Union. So it made it look like, their neighbors wanted to be with them, but they didn't. She said it was just, it's always been the Russian state. She won't call it the Soviet Union.
Mhm.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. As I sit here listening to you, I know that it would be, remiss of me if I didn't ask you um, just to give us a line on how you see American leadership in this moment. I'm afraid to hear the answer, but I need to ask it.
Well, I'll answer that personally because I'm in Canada and I've grown up with this big neighbor to the south and its influence on mass culture and everything about my life. And I've traveled throughout the US more than most people and so on. And my views about the US have matured and become more nuanced and all of this kind of thing. But the feeling in Canada in just the last 1 year has been revolutionary. The change in sentiment. A national election, which was expected to be a runaway landslide for the conservative leader, turned out to be a, a minority government for the liberal leader. And it was all because the conservative leader was looked as she's too close to Trump. And Trump just had to say 51st state, and that did it. So the United States has lost leadership in Canada. Europeans are realizing that it's lost leadership there, and it's been reinforced. Um, the Just today, um, Michael Weiss, the journalist, came out with a report of the European leaders talking with Zelensky and just saying what we cannot leave Zelensky alone with Witkoff and Kushner, and clearly that they're willing to step away from the U.S. at any cost if things keep going in this way. So the loss of leadership will, in the long term, be catastrophic because ever since the US really started to engage more with the world over a century ago, coming out of the Spanish American War and getting into its late entry into the First World War, and really coming in with the Second World War and its aftermath, U.S. leadership has been based upon taking its more values-based approach to being a nation, as opposed to ethnicity and nationality, which most countries have, and and transporting it to internationalism, globalism, um, building a country whose wealth depend on trade, which is about um, negotiating and fair dealing with trading partners and so on. And to see the United States throwing it all away so quickly, dismantling 80 years of diplomacy, um, dismantling trade agreements and arrangements that go back to Bretton Woods in 1944. Uh, and you get to the state where, um, the most trivial aspect of it is Canadians don't want to take a vacation in the US, but the more serious aspect of it is this loss of leadership um, leaves you what? It is an exaggeration because of the number of people and the size of the economy and so on. This becoming North Korea. Um, the Korea has this philosophy of juche, um, or self-sufficiency. We don't need anybody else. And this is an extreme form of American isolationism. Because of the alignment with Russia, I have at times referred to the US as the Belarus of North America. Belarus is a nice country and it could be a very fine country, but it's led by a horrible dictator who suppresses the will of the people, and he's a slave to Putin. Um, So, you know,
We just have to take it. Belarus and North America. We just have to take it. We just kind of have to take it and own it because it really rings true. And all I can say is that the former head of the Philippines is now in The Hague, awaiting trial for war crimes for, the dozens of murders in his so-called war on drugs. And every time I see Hegseth bragging and their henchwoman Carolyn Levitt boasting about it, I keep thinking, you know what? Where's Duterte? He is in The Hague. And, I don't think we're ever going to forget. And I would like to think that there will be justice in some form at some point, but I don't
there
know.
will be, and to transcend the personality, Trump will not live forever. Putin will not live forever. The question is, what is the country after that? Um,
Yeah.
and to say, is there something still left? I think there is, and that it's not lost. That the United States is not as far gone as Russia is.
Well, that at least is something. Let's end on that hopeful note. Oh my gosh, gentlemen, thank you both so much for such a rich and informative interview. Michael, I'm thrilled. I can't wait for our viewers to see this. Thank you.
Thank you very much.